we meet a Torah portion, as there are many of them, that is quite disturbing. Quite disturbing. There is this passage smack in the middle of the narrative this week that is really a horrendous story. It is fascinating that it is right there, because the Torah portion doesn't start this way. It feels like it's squeezed in between two different narratives. The first part talks about stories that are much more enlivening. It starts with Jacob wrestling with the angel in the dark of the night, the darkness of the soul, and coming out of the wrestling triumphant. At the end, being given a new name, no longer Jacob, but Israel. Israel meaning God wrestler, spiritual seeker. Sometimes Yisrael can be also read as Yashar El, which means direct to God, direct to Spirit. And then there is this amazing moment in Torah of reconciliation. Bless you. Jacob is coming back after decades of exile. He's coming back home to face what he's done. What he's done is usurp his brother's firstborn birthright and his father's blessing. And he's coming home to face the consequences because he knows that Esau vowed to kill him decades ago when he ran away. And here is the meeting between the two brothers. And instead of killing him, Esau forgives. Esau embraces his conniving brother. Esau cries on his brother's shoulder. There is peace again, wholeness in the family. And this enlivening beginning is matched on the other side by a series of announcements of death. We learn that Isaac dies in this Torah portion. We learn through a midrash that Rebekah, Isaac's wife, Jacob and Esau's mother, Rebekah also dies in this Torah portion. Even more so, Rachel, Jacob's beloved, Jacob's wife, the love of his life, dies in childbirth. It says in the Torah, by the side of the road, because Jacob and his clan were fleeing. They were on the run. Why were they on the run? Well, because of this story that is smack in the middle of the Torah portion. The story of Dinah. Now, you might not know who Dinah is because we don't really pay attention to Dinah that much. We're so focused on the 12 brothers that are going to become the 12 tribes that are going to become those who are going to conquer the land of Canaan and establish the Jewish kingdom there. Dinah is the 8th child of Leah. Leah is Jacob's first wife, the one he didn't love. He didn't want to marry her. Her father tricked Jacob into marrying her before he could marry his true love, Rachel. Yet Leah gave Jacob 8 children, 7 boys, and Dinah, the last one, the one girl with 12 brothers and stepbrothers, the only one girl in the whole clan. And here's what happened to her. Dinah, as their family was, as Jacob and his clan had now settled in Canaan and had been there for a while, settled actually near a city, a very wealthy city, the city of Shechem. Dinah one day, on her own, decides to leave the camp. The Torah says, and Dinah went out to inquire about the daughters of the land. Some commentaries are telling us that when the Torah uses the expression went out, it is not there to telling us that she left camp and she was walking toward the city of Shechem. It is an expression that every time it is used in Torah means that the person is going out to look for a husband or a wife. That's what it means to go out. Dinah went out to the city of Shechem, and the story tells us that the prince of the city, after whom it seems the city is named, the prince of the city, his name is Shechem as well, spots Dinah as she wanders through the city, I guess. And he falls in love with her. He comes to her. And then the story takes two different versions. On one hand, the rabbis and mostly male interpreters are telling us that Shechem raped Dinah. On the other hand, and many of those commentators are female commentators, interestingly enough. On the other hand, some of those commentators are telling us, no, not at all. It's not what happened. They fell in love. It was a love at first sight, and the intercourse was mutually consented. It was consensual. Everything is really decided on the interpretation of one single word in one of the verses of the Torah. Just one word could completely change how you read and understand the story. You can understand the story as rape, or you can understand the story as love at first sight. And it makes such a difference. Shechem falls in love with Dinah. He asks his father to go and talk to Jacob, her father, and do all he can because he wants to marry her. He wants to marry her. And so the king of the city and Shechem together go up to see Jacob and negotiate the sealing of their relationship into marriage. I love, if you haven't read, and I'm going to advise you for your gifting yourself for Hanukkah, the book by Anita Diamond called The Red Tent. It's an amazing telling of the story of Dinah. She writes a whole book on Dinah who's never heard of in Torah, and she writes this powerful book. And actually her rendition is that the two of them fell in love. It was love at first sight. But that doesn't matter for Dinah's brothers, Shimon and Levi. Shimon and Levi saw what happened as a personal affront. It's not clear in Torah. They don't exactly tell us why they saw this as a personal affront, but one can understand that they were frowning upon that young woman leaving the camp on her own. That young woman having intercourse with a man outside of the blessing of the clan, of the family. They were infuriated. And they were able to manipulate their father as he was negotiating the terms of the marriage to ask that, or to say that they would grant, that he would grant his permission and his blessing for the marriage at the one condition that all the males in Shechem circumcise themselves in a show of unity with the clan of Jacob. And the king and the prince who wanted this marriage agreed to Jacob's term, to Shimon and Levi's term, really. And 3 days after all the males of Shechem were circumcised, when the Torah tells us is the most painful of days. Shimon and Levi storm into the city and massacre all the males that were unable, obviously, to fight back on that day. It is an absolute bloodbath. No mercy. The king and even the prince, Shem himself, who is legally married now to Dinah, him too, they kill. Now, I told you this was not a funny story in Torah. There are many of those very dramatic and very traumatic stories. This one to me speaks of a couple things. First, the ancient concept, the ancient idea, the ancient custom of honor killing. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But second, and maybe most importantly, it speaks to me, it relates to me, to the ownership that men had on women's life in those days. Not only that, but of the way that women, not just through the story of Dinah, but in fact through the whole Torah portion, how the voices of women are completely silent. I'll get back to what I said earlier. Remember I mentioned that we know that Rebecca died in this week's Torah portion? We learned that Rebecca died, but if you heard, I said we learned from a midrash that Rebecca dies during this Torah portion. What is a midrash? A midrash is storytelling that rabbis, hundreds of years after the Torah was written, hundreds of years, who cannot understand exactly what's going on, they write stories between the verses to expand upon what the Torah is not telling us. And what the Torah is not telling us is that Rebecca died. The Torah is not telling us that Rebecca died. So the rabbis had to go in and tell us, oh, by the way, though it's not said anywhere, we want to let you know Rebecca died. And here's a little story we're going to make up around it. Rebecca completely vanishes from the pages of the Torah. Nothing is said about her. Now, I mentioned Rachel as well. I mentioned Rachel dying in childbirth by the side of the road. One of the consequences of the story of Dinah, of Jacob and his tribe, having broken a promise, having broken an agreement, a marriage agreement, have to flee. Though they had settled there probably for years, had to flee the region because they know that nobody's going to ever want to talk to them, deal with them, do commerce with them, because they are no longer trustworthy. And or they were also afraid that neighboring villages, hearing of the butchery of Jacob's family, would take revenge. And so they flee. And they didn't flee with nice cars and minivans. Traveling in biblical times was a harsh thing to do. And if you're 9.5 or 10 or whatever months pregnant, it's going to be harsh on your body. It's no wonder that Rachel dies in childbirth. I can't imagine the setup that she lived in, fleeing in those moments. Rachel gives birth, and as she's about to die, in her last breath, she names her son Ben-Oni, meaning the son of my suffering. Now, was she referring to her physical suffering? Maybe she knew that she was dying in that moment. Or was she referring to the suffering that her husband and her stepsons had brought upon the tribe with the horrendous acts that they committed. She breathes her last. And Jacob grabs the child and ignores his wife completely and renames the son not Ben-Oni, but Benjamin, Benjamin. Completely discards what her wife wanted in her last breath. Not only that, but he buries her so quickly. He barely has the time to erect a pillar, and then they're gone. There is no mention of mourning. There is no connection to any emotions that Jacob might have felt in Torah. Maybe he didn't, even though this was his most cherished, beloved, supposedly wife. But the voice whose silence is the most deafening is that of Dinah. It's true that in tribal times, men had ownership over women's lives. And it's true, this Torah portion shows it, that women were property and that men had every right that they imposed on them. And it looks like in this Torah portion, even the Torah reflects that. It looks like Dinah is an afterthought in this whole unfolding of that horrendous story. Yes, she is the one who goes to the city, but after that, all that happens between her and Shechem is only described through the eyes of Shechem. He falls in love with her. He lays with her. He goes to his father to ask Jacob for marriage. He and his father, the king, go to Jacob. He and the men of the tribe of Jacob negotiate the wedding, negotiate the marriage. She's never there. We don't know if she even enjoyed the intercourse. We have no idea if she was in love with him or not. Nothing is said about her. Nothing. It's never about her. And then, of course, you have the two brothers and this vile, repulsive concept of honor killing. That is also a proof of how much men not only control women's life, but control women's sexuality. And you know, though we might not see it in the Western world in our days, these practices are still very much alive in many parts of the world. It hasn't vanished. Quite to the contrary. I'm always moved when the Torah portion is reflecting what is happening in our life, in our days. You know, this text that is 3,000 years old is as real and alive today as it was 3,000 years ago. Because those stories are a reflection of what we have inherited. And when I say we men have inherited. We can't deny, seeing what we're seeing, that we are the inheritor of 3,000, maybe more, years of male dominance, of male violence over women, of the sense that women are properties, that we have ownership over their bodies, over their sexuality, over their lives. Sure, it shows up in different ways today that, obviously the Torah is reflecting. But we know, because we had fathers, because we have been part of this society that has reinforced through media, movies, sports, that males have to be defined, men have to be defined as aggressive, as violent, as domineering. We are still, by the way, raising our boys in reproducing the same patterns. And what we're seeing in the news these days are just a reflection of this ongoing, perhaps subconscious, domination of men over women. And I've talked to a lot of women. And I can tell you this, there's not one woman that I've talked to over the last many weeks that is surprised at all by what we are seeing happening every day in the news of all these men now accused of sexual harassment, of sexual violence. Why? Because it doesn't only happen on movie sets or TV studios or in the aisles of power. Every woman knows that it happens in the workplace, it happens in our schools, it happens in our universities, it happens when you walk down the streets, it happens at the grocery store, it happens all the time. So no, they're not surprised. It is we men who suddenly are faced with, oh my God. And we have to condemn in harshest of words the stories as they are depicted in Torah. We have to condemn in harshest of words the stories that we are hearing through our media. We men have to take a stand for our mothers, our sisters, our nieces, our cousins, our co-workers, our friends. We can no longer ignore the reality of what thousands of years of education, reinforcement, conditioning have led us to be. We, each of us men, have to look deeply inside and see which parts of ourselves are just as responsible as those we see in the limelight today. We can no longer ignore it. Now, I believe that consciousness is on the move. I believe that we are on the brink of a major step in evolution. And I believe that what we are seeing when it comes to facing our own racism, when it comes to facing our own misogyny, when it comes to facing our lack of awareness, when it comes to refugees or whomever we name the other, I think all of those are parts of the shadow that is popping up everywhere as we are about to move and transcend this state, this level of consciousness. Because we have to heal those parts before we can move on. We have to face them and we have to heal through them. Because the only way out is through. So this is my appeal to all of us men, to watch how we are raising the next generation, to watch how we are interacting with the world, and to give voice to Dinah, wherever we find her, to give voice to Rachel, wherever we find her, to give voice to Rebecca, wherever we find her.